Chapter 19. The Shout of the Slave Girl. Keeping the island of Imbros on the port bow and passing the narrow channel of the Hellespont on their starboard beam, they set the ship's course straight for Samothrace Island. They sailed on, and when the sun was setting, they saw the tumbling waters as it were a glassy sea mingled with fire. They then dropped anchor in the shelter of the island. For on their coasting journeys the smaller boats always anchored by night and sailed only by day. The sun barely tinged the distant east with pink before the anchor was hauled aboard and the sail bellied and strained to the morning breeze. The ship sailed on northward, and after running for hours before a favouring wind, the sharpest-eyed of the sailors could see, on the high ground that rose behind a city and its port, the columns of a temple which caught the rays of the sun. They ran into a spacious bay and the boat was made fast at one of the wharves of Neapolis, the port of Philippi. They had crossed the narrow water that for us divides Asia from Europe. But when Paul sailed there, all the world of the Aegean Sea was one, and, at Troy as well as at Philippi, at Ephesus in Asia as well as at Athens in Achaia, it was above everything else Greek. Out of Neapolis Paul and his companions climbed by a glen upward to the crest of the hill, where they could take breath and look back over the sea to the great plains and hills that they had left. Then they marched on again till, after 3 or 4 hours of hard travel, they clattered in through the gate of Philippi. They rested through the remaining days of the week. On the Sabbath they walked down from the city, out through the gate, and down to the river bank. The stream ran through a wide glen to the sea. There were not many Jews in Philippi, so they, it seems, had no synagogue, but met in the open by the riverside at a place of prayer. Paul and Silas, Luke and Timothy went down there together. They found a number of women met, and talked to them. Among them was a woman named Lydia, who came from Thyatira across the sea in Asia, 3 or 4 days' journey beyond Troas. She sold lovely robes from Thyatira, a city which was almost as famous as Tyre for its wonderful purple dye. Great sums of money were paid for a cloak or a toga, all woven in one piece without seam, and dyed in the purple vats at Thyatira. Lydia sat by the river listening very closely to all that Paul told them about Jesus Christ having come to show the love of God and to lead the Greeks and Jews and all people to reverence God and each other. In her native place of Thyatira she had seen her people worshipping idols, and she had been sure that God was greater than the idols. She had seen there, also, a curious worship which was partly the Jewish worship of Jehovah, but was mixed with uncleanness, and this too she felt quite sure was not really worship of the true God. The Jewish worship in Philippi, where she now lived, seemed true, yet God was still distant, though great and pure. As Lydia listened it came over her that what Paul said was the very truth, not only because he said it, but because at the same time she felt in her own inner self as though Jesus Christ had really come to her, bringing God very close to her, and was making her feel just that love which Paul said he would bring. So Lydia and her children and servants became Christian. She pressed Paul and the others to stay in her house while they were at Philippi. She begged them, saying, "If you are sure that I am a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house." "She compelled us to come," writes Luke. One day as they went down to the riverside they met a slave girl, dressed in a flowing coloured tunic, with one end of the cloth that made the tunic thrown over her dark hair. She looked at them with a curious, wistful, intent gaze. Although she was a slave girl, many people in Philippi, both Greeks and Romans, knew her, for they came to her to have their fortunes told. When she told fortunes the people paid her owners for it, which brought them a great deal of money. The sensitive girl, whose daily work was to look at people and try to see at a glance what they were like so that she might tell fortunes, felt at once that Paul's was the face of a man of great power and goodness. She stopped, and lifting up her hands she cried out so that all the people passing by could hear, "These men are slaves of the Most High God. They tell you the way to salvation." People stopped to stare, first at the girl, then at Paul and his companions. Paul and Silas and the others walked on, but she cried out the same words again, following them all down the road, declaring that they were, not like herself a slave telling fortunes for a master, but bondslaves of God telling the way of salvation. What did she mean? What did the startled people walking along the road understand when she called out, pointing to Paul and Silas, "They tell you the way of salvation"? The word that she used and that we translate salvation was soteria, and even where she stood shrieking at the side of the road there may well have been stones, like that of which a drawing stands on the previous page. A boy who knows Greek can read that one word on that stone is soteria in Greek capital letters. These stones were set up by men in the cities and villages of the world of the Great Sea and along the roadside in Paul's day. Each stone was a prayer to the gods for that strange something which they called salvation. So when the slave girl stood there, crying out about Paul and Silas, "They tell you the way of salvation," she used a word that all the people as they went by would understand. More than that, the fact that men everywhere set up these stones asking for soteria showed that it stood for something that they greatly desired. The slave girl could not leave them, would not leave them. She followed Paul and his friends down to the river bank and back again. She walked behind them through the streets till they went into Lydia's house. And all the next day she vexed them again, calling out in the street, "These men tell you the way of salvation." What did the word mean to the young sandaled Greek student, in his white tunic with his wax tablet slung on a tape over his arm and his writing stylus in his hand, going down to his class and coming home from the gymnasium all glowing with exercise? To him soteria (salvation) meant that he should be lifted up with the fullness of the stature of an all-round man. If he cared simply for wrestling and throwing the javelin, then salvation meant being freed from every disease of body, every weakness of muscle and nerve, and being made a perfect athlete and warrior. This young student, coming up the high street of Philippi, knew, however — he would have learned from his tutor how the great Greek teachers like Socrates said — that he was not only made up of body and of mind, but that his inmost being was spirit. There in Philippi, as in all the Greek cities of Paul's day, men were initiated into the mysteries of worship of gods. As a man was led into the innermost mystery by strange ceremonial, the very life of the god, they believed, came into him, so that the man became immortal as the god was immortal. This deliverance from the fear of evil and from the power of death, through union with the God of the mystery religion, was, to the Greek man of Paul's day, and to many of the people of Asia, salvation. Salvation, then, meant that the Spirit who makes the world and creates all men, the Most High God, as the Greek slave girl in Philippi called him in the common language of the day, would pour into this Greek student or any boy power and greatness and well-being and immortal life. It was of such salvation as this that Paul wrote when he said, in the most wonderful sentences in the greatest letter that he or any man ever wrote, "I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and earth gets its name and nature, pleading with him, out of the wealth of his glory, to give you a mighty increase of strength by his Spirit in the inmost man. May Christ live in your heart as you have faith. May you be so fixed, so firmly founded in love that you are able to grasp with all the saints what is the meaning of the breadth, the length, the depth, the height, by knowing the love of Christ which goes beyond all knowledge. May you be filled with the entire fullness of God." A Jewish boy, stopped on his way from the synagogue school by the sound of this piercing voice of the slave girl, crying, "These men are slaves of the Most High God. They tell you the way of salvation," would think first of the promised coming of the Prince who should lead all the chosen people, the Jews, and establish their kingdom. To a Jewish boy in Philippi the word "salvation" meant that he would have a place in the new age which the Messiah was to bring — the Kingdom of God. The slave girl was, both to the Greek and the Jewish way of thinking about salvation, far truer than she ever dreamed when she shouted after Paul that he told men the way of salvation. For he showed how Jesus Christ brought men the mighty increase of strength, and the healing and cleansing from the disease of foul living that the Greek needed, to the Jew the coming of the new kingdom, and to all the immortal life that they desired. At last Paul's patience was gone. He turned to the girl as she was crying out to the gaping crowd of people. He called out sternly to the spirit in her that prompted her, " In the name of Jesus Christ, I order you out of her." Startled, the girl lost all belief in her powers. Something had gone from her. People came to her as they had been used to doing, saying, " I have lost a bracelet. Tell me where to find it." Or, " I want to go on a journey. Will the ship be wrecked, or shall I travel safely if I go now?" But she could not answer their questions. Her old confidence had altogether gone. So the people went away, without paying the slave girl's masters. In a few days people stopped going to her. So the money that used to flow into the purses of her owners from people who listened to her fortune-telling ceased to come. The masters were naturally furious. They went out telling people what had happened, and, searching through the streets, they found Paul and Silas. Rushing up to them, they seized them by the arms and robes and dragged them along the streets. " To the praetors! " was the cry. The praetors were the Roman officials in Philippi, very officious, very anxious to get promotion by showing how they upheld the power of Rome. The masters of the slave girl came into the forum, where the praetors sat, dragging Paul and Silas along, and at their heels came a shouting mob. The praetors sat in their marble chairs on a raised dais. On either side stood the Roman lictor, each carrying the axe and the bundle of rods that were the mark of the authority of Rome. " See these fellows," the men cried out, " Jews as they are upsetting everything in the city. They tell people to take up customs that are against the law for us as Romans to accept." " Yes, yes," cried the crowd. " Flog them, flog them." The praetors, without asking Paul or Silas a single question as to whether this was true, or allowing them to make any defence, were fussily eager to show their Roman patriotism. Standing up they gave their orders. " Strip them, flog them." Chapter 20